My name is William Harrop, Bill Harrop. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer who had a career of 39 years in the Foreign Service and was ambassador to 5 countries as well as Inspector General of the State Department and Foreign Service during that time. I was later chairman of the American Foreign Service Association. And this story is going to be one that perhaps is not in earth-shaking strategic terms, but it was a very distinct diplomatic victory in a relatively modest scale. In 1958, President Charles de Gaulle decided he had to do something about the African colonies in Africa, of which there were probably 10 or a dozen. So he said, okay, we will have a referendum, and each African country must decide if it wants to be part of a new French union with Africa, in which you'll have a lot of autonomy, a lot of special help from France, or whether you want to be independent, completely away from your old colonial status. Well, all of the other African countries decided they would stay with France and be part of the French Union, except Guinea. Sékou Touré, who was president of Guinea, was a socialist, really. He was the father of African socialism. He was a crypto-communist in many ways, and he took Guinea out of the French orbit. And in 1958, Guinea was really quite isolated because the French punished him for this. When the French colonial officers left Guinea, they ripped out the telephones, they ripped out the basins from the bathrooms. They just left nothing that would be of any use to a new independent African country. And his answer, which is not surprising, was to turn toward the East. He became really a client state of the Soviets, and they helped him a great deal. They built railroads for him, they built a port, they built a hospital, they built an airport, they in fact really built a whole bauxite industry. Bauxite, the ore of aluminum, is a very plentiful item in Guinea. In fact, Guinea has over half of the world's bauxite, it so happens. And so the Soviets did that. Well, I came there as ambassador 14 years later. Meanwhile, Sékou Touré had been very difficult for the West and the United States to work with. He had expelled the Peace Corps. He was a very difficult fellow and simply insisted that his country was going to be a socialist country, was going to have collective farming, was going to be operating on a very much of a collectivist style. I arrived in 1975, and I had an office of 15 people, an embassy of 15 people. There was a giant Soviet mission of 950 officers there in this small African country, providing technical assistance, military assistance, all sorts of help, arms, everything you could imagine. So it was, I would say, it was a slightly imbalanced Cold War competition. Guinea's collective farming, like most collective farming, was very inefficient. They could not feed their country anymore. It had been a rich agricultural country, but they just simply couldn't do it. And they were living pretty much on American food aid. We had a food assistance program called Public Law 480. And under Public Law 480, we sold, and I put sold in quotation marks, we sold grains, commodities that we had, I must say, in surplus. We sold to developing countries in return for their local currency. In the case of Guinea, the local currency was the cedi. And so we had huge stocks of really non-convertible cedis because we sold them hundreds of millions, billions of dollars worth of food for their local currency, the same as the United States had huge stocks of Polish zlotys and Indian rupees for the same reason. One thing was going on which I found really quite offensive. Touré insisted he was non-aligned. He insisted that he was an admirer of John Kennedy, who he thought had been a grand person and an admirer of the United States in many ways. But he was really a client of the Soviets. He depended on them almost entirely for his support, both political and economic and military. So he allowed giant Soviet bombers, which were configured for electronic surveillance. These were called Tupolev 95, Tu-95 bombers, four-engine bombers, to land regularly at the airport, which the Soviets had built for him, in Conakry, the capital of Guinea. And they would then fly between Conakry and other Soviet protectorate countries, Angola and Cuba, making a regular circuit between these countries, but also flying over the North Atlantic, harassing the NATO fleets, American and Allied shipping and naval vessels in the Atlantic. And this was really quite an offensive situation. I spoke to President Touré about this, and I said, really, you're taking part in the Cold War. You don't want to do this. You're assisting the communist side, and I think it's best not to do that. And he said, no, I'm not aligned. I'm a friend of everybody. But he would not stop the flights. I looked around for some kind of a leverage to use on him, and I realized that this Public Law 480 food program was the perfect leverage because they were absolutely dependent upon it for nourishment. On the other hand, I knew that with President Jimmy Carter in office, a great humanitarian, there was no way I was going to get instructions from Washington to use our humanitarian food aid as leverage for a political security issue. And so I didn't report to Washington. I just found that fall when it was time to negotiate the annual Public Law 480 agreement, I found it very difficult. I delayed it, I raised questions about it, I temporized, and Secretary finally got the idea. And he became quite angry about this, but he was rather cornered. His way of communicating with his people, strangely enough, was to put up big billboards, poster boards around the streets of Conakry and also elsewhere in the country. And so he put up great big posters which said, down with food blackmail, à bas le chantage alimentaire. And that may have given him some satisfaction, but I was probably the only one in the country who understood what that meant. However, I kept it up and kept delaying the Public Law 480 arrangement for him, and he relented. He stopped the Soviet flights, didn't allow them to do it anymore, although I think that was probably difficult for him in his arrangements with Moscow. But he did that, and the North American or the NATO fleet was no longer bothered by the Tu-95s, and the episode was closed. It was a very small but really quite effective little bit of diplomacy, which I was actually quite proud of, although the Assistant Secretary for Africa when he found out about this, was very angry because he knew that the White House would not like it at all, even though it was very good for America's strategic interests.